Hello, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Steve Marks, member of CMC's Board of Trustees and president of Hannah News Service here in Columbus. When I say it's great to see you today, it truly is great to see people in this room again. Over the past several weeks, racism and systemic bias is being acknowledged as never before. In our longstanding tradition, CMC is developing forums that provide community space to explore these issues in a continuing series, Racism, Where Do We Go From Here? We are live streamed thanks to our live stream partners, WOSU Public Media, the Dispatch Media Group, WBNS TV, and PNC. We'd also like to thank those of you who have purchased a virtual seat for today's forum. We are very grateful for this support and are able to continue live streaming services in large part because of you. Thank you. Today's forum, How Media Perpetuates Bias, is brought to us with support from the Saunders Company. Won't you please help me thank them? Countless studies over the years have revealed examples of bias in media. Bias in today's media and in other places perpetuates stereotypes, fuels unconscious bias that directly impacts how we think, feel, and act. Where do we go from here? Please welcome Senior Legal Analyst, OSU Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, Kyle Strickland. Director of Community Affairs for WBNS 10 TV, Angela Pace. And our host, retired co-anchor, WBNS 10 TV, Jerry Revish. Jerry, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And thanks for all who've come today, and to our two guests. We appreciate you. We're talking about bias in the media. Wanted to drill down as we look at this topic about racial bias in the media. It's stubborn, it's pernicious, it's a problem across all media, television, radio, newspapers, social media. Sometimes the bias is blatant, other times very subtle, but always damaging. It gets played out in decision-making often, how stories are told, who tells the story, and what stories get told. The media remains a predominantly white-dominated business. Many reporters, producers, and assignment editors have little, if any, real understanding about Black life, Black culture, Black people. It's not part of their life experience. And all of us, Black, white, Asian, Latino, you name it, all view life through the lens of our own experience. It gets reflected in how we do our jobs. The pursuit of truth, though, must transcend those differences. I want to pose a question to my panel today as we start here. What does racial bias in the media look like? What does it sound like?
Well, since I'm the oldest person up here, with the exception of Jerry, I'll start. This is what it looks like. Sitting in a newsroom, listening to your producers and your assignment editors talk about the stories that we're going to cover for the 11 p.m. news. Having your assignment editor yell out, hey, we got another shooting on the Near East Side, and the producer say, another shooting on the Near East Side? Okay, we'll put it in the second block. We won't even send a reporter, let's just send a photographer to spray the scene. And then you sit there and say, no, what do you mean another shooting? A life was lost. It's not just another shooting. And they, okay, there she goes again, and then they go on about their business. About a month later, there's a fatal shooting in Dublin. You would have thought that the world had ended. The whole newsroom was up in arms because, oh my God, somebody in Dublin had been shot and killed. Well, we're going to tag team it. Oh, it's definitely a lead. We got to make sure we do something new for the 11. And I said, so is that person in Dublin deader than the young man who was shot on the Near East Side last month? And again, they look at me like, oh, there she goes again. That's what racial bias in a newsroom is like.
And Kyle, when you think about a racial bias in media, what comes to mind for you?
Of course. So what comes to mind is immediately Black Lives Matter, and being able to say that Black Lives Matter is truth, is speaking truth to power, and knowing that in the media that we see, you see depictions of Blackness as criminality. You see depictions of those in poverty as less deserving as others. You see all sorts of depictions that tell the story of America and where we are. Just like Angela just said, you just really just bat another eye if it's, well, that's a shooting on the Near East Side, that's expected. It's sick. It shows a lack of valuing for black life. And so it's important for us to recognize that media perpetuates these biases over and over and over again, and honestly, it normalizes it. It normalizes that here in a society where we can see this type of violence in any particular community is seen as, well, that's just another shooting, let's move on to some other story. When we need to talk about how black life is valued, and it's represented not just in crime, but also in success. It's represented in so much there that is not seen in our media, and so as a result, you see stereotypes that are perpetuated over and over and over again. There's racism within all of our media departments. It is a thing, it is real, and we have to address that because it is part of a larger problem in our society that we have yet to fully address.
And one of the things that I always tried to do when I was reporting and anchoring was to help to fight the stigma, the bias, the impressions that Kyle was just talking about. Whenever I was sent out to do a story, I always tried to find a black expert. I wanted a black person on TV to be someone other than a basketball player, a rapper, or somebody in handcuffs. So I remember I had to do a banking story. I don't do numbers very well at all, and I had to do a banking story on mortgages or something stupid like that. And I remember thinking, there's got to be a black banker somewhere. And my good friend Jerry Hammond turned me on to Warren Tyler, who was a vice president at State Savings at the time. And Warren Tyler became my go-to banking guy. And then I had to do something on psychological impact of blah, blah, blah one day. And I thought, there's got to be a black psychologist. And I met a guy named Lewis Dodd, who then was able to be my black expert. Those are the kinds of things that when you're a reporter, when you're an anchor, you try to do to combat the stereotype. Okay, so there goes homeboy off in handcuffs. Look at this man up here who is going to tell me how a compound fracture mortgage works. So those are the kinds of battles that we have to fight every single day.
All the more reason why diversity is such a vital part of all business experience, and particularly in our business as well, because you got to have diverse voices around the table, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But picking up on what you were talking about, perceptions about black people. I remember when The Cosby Show first started on TV. It was a big hit for like 5 years in a row. It was like the #1 show. The Huxtables, an obstetrician married to, excuse me, a lawyer. And many years ago, a former colleague of mine, having watched that show, turned to me one day and said, "Do black people really live like that?" And it caught me by surprise for a moment, but then if the only perception you have of black people is the crime blotter perception, then seeing two successful professionals like that on TV raising a great family to you might feel very foreign. Normal, stable black family life doesn't get presented as much as white family life does. And when's the last time you saw a beggar's night story shot in a black neighborhood? We never go into those neighborhoods to do a Halloween story. Too often it's not even a consideration. Let's move on now. Can you explain why it is that whenever a black person, this was a question someone sent in, whenever a black person is a suspect in a crime, they're identified as a black man was seen fleeing the scene. But when a white person is the suspect, they don't mention race at all. It stereotypes and criminalizes an entire race. You think this writer was on to something there?
I remember when I was watching the news as a little girl, my grandmother always made us watch the news, and I remember that it was like somebody like Chet Long or Bill Pepper, one of the old guys from the good old days, who was describing a suspect, and they said, this was before we were black, we were colored back then, and he said the suspect is a colored man with maroon eyes. And I thought, maroon eyes? What in the hell is maroon? Whose eyes are maroon? Isn't that purple? That was the standard descriptor used to describe black people. They were colored and had maroon eyes. And God forbid they had gray eyes, but maroon eyes. And that stuck with me for years and years and years and years. And Jerry, I hope you can relate to this. I'm sure you can. When you're sitting on the anchor desk and you're reading a story about a suspect, someone who has held up a gas station or someone who has shot up a graduation party, and I'm sitting there and I'm reading the words, but in my head and in my heart, I'm going, don't be black, don't be black, don't be black, don't be black. Please don't be black. And police say the suspect was a black man, about 5'10", and then your heart sinks. So Jerry, I've forgotten your question. I've just gotten off on a tangent.
Pipe in, Kyle.
Yeah, no. So when you see these types of narratives over and over again, black suspect coming in here. Sorry, I gotta get water. Angela got me cracking up.
Sorry.
So one of the narratives that you see, when I see this, I think, wow, well, I better not be walking around outside, because when I see these narratives, the description is somebody who looks like me. I mean, it is a consistent thing that you see time and time again, where you're supposed to be fearful of black people. You're supposed to be fearful of these criminals that are coming to get you and your kids and your communities. It overemphasizes the amount of violence that's actually in your community versus, the facts that people have different perspectives, different backgrounds, and you don't describe the types of school shooters that we often see, which have been predominantly white. You tend to have folks say, well, that's a mental health issue. That's what that issue is, which also further stigmatizes those with mental health issues, and instead, doesn't get at some of the root issues, looking at things like the issues of gun violence and the pervasiveness of guns in our society, and it tries to pinpoint criminality on people. All of it is rooted in racism and this idea that there's some sort of personal deficit or some sort of cultural or group flaw with a set of people which makes them criminals or more likely to be criminals. This is why you see terms like super predators, all these terms during the time of the war on drugs, where this was to criminalize black and brown communities. And what isn't highlighted is the fact that there are some places in the suburbs who are committing crimes at similar rates. They're just not getting over-policed and over-surveilled. And they aren't looked at the same way as a dangerous suspect as others might be. And so I think we perpetuate these narratives when we talk about these suspects that we see over and over again. Black people are more than just suspects. We are people, and our lives matter, period, point blank.
And speaking of criminalizing, about 15 years ago, I went shopping, went to a discount store, and I've got objects in my hand trying to compare prices and ingredients and all that. And there had been this little boy, about 6 or 7 years old, little white boy, just ripping and racing up and down the aisles. And I realized after a few minutes that he had stopped at the end of the aisle I was in, and he was staring at me. And I smiled and said, "Hi, how are you?" He said, "Are you stealing those?" And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Are you stealing those?" Well, I was so completely caught off guard. Those of you who know me know that I am rarely at a loss for words, but I had no response. He said, "Are you stealing those?" And I opened my mouth to say, "Well, of course not." And he said, "My daddy says all black people steal, and that's what we see on TV." And I opened again my mouth to say, "Where is your daddy? I got something for your daddy." And I said, "No, I said, well, no, I have money and I'm going to buy these. Go tell your daddy that." Here's this child, this 6 or 7-year-old child, who through what his daddy said and what he has seen on TV figured that this black person with product from a store in her hands had to be trying to figure out how she was going to slip it down her bra or put it in her purse and leave without paying for it. So that's criminalizing.
Criminalizing, and it's generational.
Yeah.
I suspect the conversation around the dinner table sometimes leads to that kind of thinking. Back to the thought of identifying people by race in stories. I, for one, don't think racial identifiers tell you much of anything about that person. A suspect description is supposed to be about how a person looks. When you say a black teen, 15 years old, T-shirt, jeans, seen running from wherever. Okay, well, how black was he? What color black are we talking about? We come in all shades. So when you say something like that with a blanket statement, you are criminalizing and really slandering a whole population. And part of that has its roots in police work. We hear the scanner traffic. 3 white males running down the street having broken windows. That's what the police have to go on. And if they see 3 white males, without any more description than that, then a lot of 3 white males are going to be suspects. So it's a problem there. What does an Hispanic person look like? How about an Irish American? What do they look like? I mean, if you try to draw an image in your mind, that picture is probably going to be stereotypical. So those are the things that we as news people, looking at copy when it comes across our desk, and sometimes gets right there in the prompter, and we've got to do a quick edit on the fly because it got overlooked because it was thought to be okay. So how important is diversity in the newsroom and in the decision-making process?
You got to have voices at the table. You absolutely have to have voices at the table. And unfortunately, when folks start hiring in newsrooms, the first thing they think about, well, we got to have somebody black on air. So we got to have an Angela Pace, or we have to have a Jerry Revish, we have to have a Tracy Townsend. And unfortunately, sometimes it stops there. And they don't even think about the fact that, gee, it would be nice to have a black producer, because the producers are the ones with the power. Those are the ones who are deciding which stories go into which shows. Gee, maybe, how about we have a black photographer who can frame a shot in a way that doesn't make it look like all the black people at this picnic are getting ready to go on some kind of a rampage. Gee, how about a black assignment editor who's listening to the scanners and determining which stories he's going to send crews out on? How about a black marketing director? There's a thought. Somebody who actually looks at and thinks about what kind of an image they want this station to portray. It is so important that you have not the bodies at the table, but the voices at the table, and that you listen to those voices. But in a business like TV, where I think that, and I don't know how many television stations we have now, 300, whatever, probably a lot more than that than it was when I was working, but the last number I saw was that maybe 6% of the news directors in television are African American. Well, no, let me take that back, because I think it said people of color, so that would then bring in Hispanics and Asians and, you know, all of the minority populations. And I think something like 1.5% general managers, those are the big bosses. So when you're looking at those kinds of numbers, then of course you're not going to get the diversity, you're not going to get the eyeballs that can see the world through a different lens. You're not going to get that. What you're going to get is what you see, and that is lots of times a newscast that is framed, produced, created in the eyes of a white man, or, because we've got more women news directors now, a white woman. And that is not America, folks. That's not America.
Now, Kyle, you spend a lot of time in bias training. What are you training people to see?
Yeah, so there's a couple things for that. So one, it's always recognizing that we all have biases. So the way that we grow up, the way our life experiences have been, the way that media depicts people, that all affects and adds into stereotypes that affects our decision making. We make quick decisions. That's how we're able to operate as humans. But the problem is when we make those quick decisions and shortcuts, we rely on these types of stereotypes that perpetuates inequality. And so one of the things that we talk about in some of our bias trainings and a lot of the work that I do is more so also on policy change and cultural change, because it's one thing to say, well, we know that racism and diversity is an issue, so we're going to have an implicit bias training. Check it off the box. The diversity box has been checked, when in fact, just being aware of the biases you have, that is important. But you also have to do something about it. And that also means that when you have people into the table, you don't see diversity as an afterthought. You don't see diversity as, well, we met our mark, they're at the table, but we actually don't take their voice seriously, as Angela said, when they speak up. Or that's just them going on whatever tangent that they're going on. That's not reflective of what we need to talk about. So what we talk about in bias is not just about our biases that we hold, but about the history of this country and how the context of where we are affects today. The facts are that this nation was founded on the genocide of indigenous peoples and enslaved African people. And that still affects us today because you have laws like Jim Crow, you have all sorts of redlining, segregation, all of that permeates into our structure. So none of this happens in a vacuum. And some people get upset about people talking about terms like systemic racism. I've seen, watching the live stream of any sort of newscast and seeing the comment feed that are probably happening right now about people being so upset about people talking about racism. They're so tired about talking about racism. I wish they would put that energy into actually dismantling these systems of inequality and oppression. And so when we talk about issues of bias, we say it's not enough just to recognize that we have our own biases. We also have to recognize that there are systems in place that provide certain privileges and benefit of the doubt on certain people, in many cases it's white people, over others. And then you talk about things like sexism and all sorts of other facets of our society that we need to address.
And when we see the current tumult in our country now over police shootings and police brutality, violence that way, I guess a refreshing wind is blowing in a sense of not all the protesters are just black people. We're seeing a broad spectrum of people and a lot more white people out there agitating for that change. And I think it's that kind of movement that is going to help push all of this along. How does the abundance or lack of oversight in streaming media, social media, affect reporting and the reporting landscape, if that's a question you can get to?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'll just highlight is there's got to be some accountability. The facts are that we live in a country where free speech is a thing and people can say what they want to say, but there's also got to be consequences for certain actions. If you've got some of these people, let's say on the news feed or social media that are making racist or sexist or problematic comments, that's a conversation you have with their employer about are these the values that we would like to see in our organization, and why is this somehow accepted in our conversation? We normalize this type of behavior, and yet we are also in a society that is over punitive on small petty crimes. Right? There are things in which we as a society seek locking people up for any sort of issue, and yet when it comes to what we tolerate from racist, sexist remarks and behavior, that's just kind of like, well, they just kind of are like that. That's how they grew up. That's just their way of life. They didn't mean necessarily anything by it. We need to be more forceful and say, that's not okay. It's not enough just to be not racist. We have to be anti-racist. We have to call out that behavior in our colleagues, our friends, our neighbor, and our families. We've got to call that behavior out because that is unacceptable, and it makes people feel that they can say these types of things. And sadly, this is the type of behavior that we are seeing at the top office of the land. We are seeing these types of conversations, and people don't necessarily want to wade into it because they don't want to be seen as partisan. But we need to have a conversation that this isn't an issue just of partisanship. This is an issue about what we value and what we normalize in our society. The facts are that you cannot just say that a racist remark that somebody said was racially tinged or had some see it as racism when it was clearly a racist remark. Those are things in headlines that we see that we need people to be more bold and forceful on to say that's not okay.
It is a problem, and there's a lot of pressure on reporters to make sure that they present the story in a way that's going to be consumed by viewers and without not a whole lot of upset. And
Jerry,
that's sad to say.
One of the things that bothered me when the protest started in downtown Columbus was when that started and we started covering the unrest, we didn't have any black reporters on the street. We had Tracy and Yolanda in the newsroom or anchoring from their homes at that time. But we had no black reporters because we had no black reporters in our shop. We had 2 black female reporters. One of them left in, I think, April, and then the other one, Sierra, left like the day the protest, the day George Floyd was murdered. She got another job, and we had no black reporters covering this story. Why is that important? Hey, it's fine. And we did a great job. Seriously, our reporters did yeoman work out there. They really, really did. And I felt bad for them because they were getting tear gassed, and some of the protesters were throwing things at them because they were white. So they were in it. They were in it, and they did a great job. But they were just covering the protest. What about beyond the protest? What about why people were upset? Our reporters maybe kind of sort of knew why, but their frame of reference was totally different from that of a black person who could really, really understand what George Floyd's murder meant to black people in this country. So that's when, for some reason, I started getting dragged into the editorial meetings because, oh my God, we've got Angela, she's black, let's see what she has to say. So I started suggesting, let's look beyond, let's look at the reason for the protest. Go talk to Al Edmondson, who has a barbershop on Mount Vernon Avenue, is doing everything he can to build up that neighborhood. He can tell you why. Go talk to Pastor Victor Davis. He can tell you why. His church is right there in the hood. He can tell you why. Get some perspective. Get the story behind the story. Not saying that we didn't do a good job covering the protest. That was the news of the day. This goes beyond the news of the day. These are people's lives we're talking about.
It's called balance and fairness. And when you're talking about racial things, there's always this mindset by some that you're picking sides. I think a true journalist, you mentioned our journalists out on the street covering the riots, the protests, they did what a true journalist is supposed to do: cover what they see, look for the truth, and present that. So we can't be cowered into not doing those things that are uncomfortable. Because it's important that those voices are heard. A lot of times we'll get stories on, and we may touch on this a little later. Anytime we do a story about the president, if it's not complimentary, we are piling on, we're being biased. There's such a thing as truth, and I think truth doesn't have a color. I think truth doesn't have a station. You have got to come down on the side of the truth. Now, if statistics that are mentioned are not correct, if they're wrong, we are abdicating our responsibility by not making sure that we say that, right? Yeah. I wanted to talk about a couple other things here. Remember the opioid addiction crisis? It's still with us. But it really didn't get the traction that it should have gotten 50 years ago, perhaps, when it was just in our neighborhood, when heroin was on the Near East Side or some of the other pockets of poverty and disadvantage. that's those people. But when it started creeping into the suburban neighborhoods and kids there were four-star students and athletes were dying from this opioid epidemic, then we started really thinking about that. Well, just give me a reflection on why do you think that happened that way?
Yeah, I mean, so clearly it was racialized. The facts are that the war on drugs was a clear experiment that was done to punish, over-surveil Black and brown communities, and to try to forget and disinvest in communities. And what was seen then is, well, they've got a drug problem. That's a problem. That's a personal behavior, group behavior problem that they are criminals, and we shouldn't address that. We just need to arrest them, lock them up, and throw the key away. Just absolutely terrorizing families and communities, just completely terrorizing these families and communities. And so when you see the opioid epidemic, you start to see this affecting the suburbs and other people, more white people, and affluent white people, and not just poor Black and brown people. You start to see this conversation of, well, these are actually humans. These are actually people that are dying and that have real experiences that I can relate to because they look like me or they're part of my family or my neighborhood. When it was happening to other people, those were those other people out there that I couldn't necessarily relate to because there's something that's not quite the same about them than about my own community, my own neighborhood. And so it is, now I will say, it is critical and important that we are now seeing this as a public health crisis, which it is. This is a public health crisis, but so too was the issue in the 80s and early 90s. And so when we start to see this frame of reference, we start to look at the social determinants. You start to look at the structures and the systems that lead people in these situations in the first place. And instead of criminalizing these issues, you start to provide help and assistance and support. That's what we are willing to do more often than not for white people who look like the majority, and less so for those who don't look like us. And we need to start, and that's why it's so important when we say Black Lives Matter, it's because everything in media in our society has shown that we don't value Black lives the same way we value white lives. And we've got to address that. And so I think that's the shift. It's clear, it was a clearly racialized shift where people realized that it impacted them too, not just people far away in other neighborhoods.
Back when we were covering the crack addiction, the folks that were being arrested, being hauled off, were crackheads. And now they're opioid addicts. It's all in the branding.
All in the branding, and really now we're getting down, as you mentioned, it's a public health crisis. We're seeing a lot more resources poured into prevention, rehabilitation helps that way now. So, you know, unfortunately it had to come this way, but we're also benefactors of the help that's coming through. Bias in covering law enforcement. Sometimes I think reporters pull punches when it comes to police-related stories for fear of offending some viewers, or even the police union. I've had, in my experience in my reporting years, I've had a public information officer on the other end of the phone who said, if you run that story, you are never going to get another comment out of me ever. We've got to be able to, in the media, we've got to be able to withstand these sorts of pressures and tell the truth. An officer-involved shooting is a dainty way of saying the police shot someone. We need to be clearer, more precise in our language when we talk about these things that are happening in our community. No?
Look, what I would say is this is so critical, so important when we talk about the issue of police violence, because the implications of state-sanctioned violence against people just shows the power dynamics that there, where police are given the responsibility and the power to have a weapon and to kill somebody and to have that justified. And because our laws are set up in ways which, with qualified immunity and all sorts of things, where those police killings are almost always, quote unquote, justified. And we have to start asking ourselves the questions like, maybe we need to really be serious if we're going to be giving folks this much power. We can't just let them go off and do whatever it is that they want. And that's not a statement that says, oh, well, all people are bad if they're in the police department. That's not that statement. It is saying that there is a culture of this sort of violence and brutality that needs to be rooted out. And because what we see tends to happen is, well, you know, so-and-so deserved it, or maybe they shouldn't have ran away, or maybe they shouldn't have been resisting. Okay. Does that mean they should have been killed for that? And so whenever you look at these, that's why you see the situation like George Floyd, because the police officer had his knee on his neck. And people say, there's no way you can justify something like this. But then you see Rayshard Brooks or others who might have been resistant or run away, and they say, well, they shouldn't have been resisting. And all of this over and over again just shows how diminishing we look at black life, that any sort of criticism of the way that our policing is in this country is somehow an indictment on every person as an individual and what they believe as an individual, rather than a culture of violence that is perpetuated on our communities and that hurts people and devalues people. We need to start addressing this, that we can't be afraid to speak truth to power. We cannot be afraid to speak truth to power.
But to Jerry's point, there is so much power. And if you do tell the story the way the story needs to be told, then there are repercussions. And as Jerry said, there are those, or at least were back in my day, those PIOs who would say, no, you're not getting any information because we don't like the way you covered this story. We don't like the fact that we told you not to say this and yet you did. When I was on the street, I would always pray at a crime scene that I could find a black police officer. I would always pray, please let there be somebody, let Herbie be out here, let JoJo be out here, let somebody who looks like me be out here, who maybe will give me the information that I want, especially if it was a crime in a black neighborhood. They're gonna tell me the story. They're gonna give me the real. And if I couldn't find Herbie or JoJo or whoever, then I had to hope that I found a white officer who would give me the straight story. And that should not be what covering a news story is all about.
We're going to move now to some questions from the audience here that we may have.
Yes, I'm Jane Scott with the Metropolitan Club, and I am going to be asking questions on behalf of people who asked them when they registered. Tracy Ross, as an individual, are there recommended strategies one can undertake besides turning off the TV, discontinuing the publication, or sharing one's frustration on Facebook to alter our local media's narrative?
I think one of the things that newsrooms respond to, news directors respond to, is when people get on the phone and call the station. When they hear someone on the other end of that phone complaining about something, they pause. They will listen. It doesn't always mean there's going to be a change, but you've got to agitate. You've got to let people, you can't let silence be the response. If you see or hear something that you don't like or doesn't tell the story the way it should be told, call the station. We live on phone calls, so don't be afraid to call.
Even better, write a letter. The FCC, we have letters. As Community Affairs Director, the FCC, I have to make sure that we send FCC reports in, making sure we're covering all the stories that matter to people. And we also then turn into, or at least we used to, turn into the FCC viewer letters. So I tell everybody, if you have a complaint, send an email, phone call, or write a letter, because that will, as Jerry said, that will get attention.
Hi, I'm Carol Looper, and I was a reporter with both of these wonderful people for a long, long time. My question is, how important is it that the Columbus Dispatch is now capitalizing the B when they use the word black.
Thanks to the New York Times. I think New York Times did it first, yeah. You know, it's interesting with the Dispatch. Back in May, about the middle of May, there were a lot of black folks who were up in arms because of something on the op-ed piece in the Columbus Dispatch. And it had something to do with Mayor Ginther saying that we were going to encourage more minority vendors to bid on jobs. And the Dispatch ran an editorial saying, yeah, well, let's make sure that these minority vendors know that they're really good, that they can do the job. And folks were up in arms, as they should have been. And I hope that there were some white people who were also offended by that, because the implication was that if we open up this bidding or encourage more minority vendors, well, their work is really going to have to be scrutinized, because of course it can't be on the same level as a majority vendor. To their credit, to Alan Miller's credit, he did respond. He responded to all the letters, all the phone calls, all the emails, and that shows accountability, which really did impress me. So I'm very, very impressed that the Columbus Dispatch is now woke and that they are going to be capitalizing the B in black.
And that's so critical. I mean, you know, I do a lot of research and writing, and we see all sorts of publications where this has been an issue, and more scholars have been talking about the importance of capitalizing black and why that's important, especially when you talk about all of the sorts of marginalizations of identity and groups and cultures, and to be able to capitalize black and why that helps to address how we view people and their context in our history. And so I think it is critical, important. Language is really important. How we talk about things is critical. So that's a step in the right direction. Obviously, a lot more needs to be done, but it is a step in the right direction.
Another question?
I have two questions that are similar, so I'm going to ask them together. I think the answers might be similar. Trip Lazarus asks, how can the media lead the way in re-education of our citizens? And Steve Gravenkemper, what can the media do to promote healing and bringing people together to make things better in the future? So sort of a similar theme, I think, between those questions.
So I'll take the bringing people together piece. So one of the things people have to realize is that there's no kumbaya moment when we're talking about racism. You know, this is not a thing where people are just going to come together and over a meal and talk about how we all need to be united. You know, the facts are that the tensions that we have in our society is the result of not talking about these issues and being uncomfortable with these issues and thinking that we don't need to be divisive about it. We just need to come together and stop talking about racism. The more you talk about the racism, the more it's a problem, when that's in fact not the case. And instead, people need to stop treating this as an academic exercise. They need to stop treating this as like, well, what do black people think about this? And instead, listen to people's lived experiences and be willing to confront your own biases. And so what that means then is saying, I've got to hold myself accountable and recognize that I've been part of the problem, and don't take that as an indictment or an attack on you as a person. You can do something about that moving forward, and the media has a role to play in ensuring that the stories we uplift are black voices, black perspectives, black experiences, and that doesn't diminish white people. That's just uplifting the black voice and perspective that has been marginalized for too long. And so when the Dispatch will also run a piece that's, you know, has a headline that says, quote, heritage, not hate, and talks about how some people in rural Ohio see the Confederate flag as a part of their heritage and not racism, when the facts do not point to that, and that this notion here that we can just say these types of things and quote just anybody and say that that's normalized, that's not okay. So the media has a role to play in leveling the platform of what is okay and just what isn't okay.
And that has to happen inside the media newsrooms and offices. One of the things that our station manager asked me to do when the protest weren't going to be just an overnight thing, that they were going to go on and on and on. He asked me to get together some community leaders so that we could do a Zoom meeting and have these community leaders talk to our newsroom managers to hopefully give them some perspective on exactly what was going on, to talk about why Black lives do matter and why it's important that we start these conversations. And that was the beginning of a conversation. I brought together 5 folks who, not your usual suspects, but folks who are boots on the ground, who are really in the trenches working to make sure that Black lives matter. And they had a great, very open conversation with our newsroom managers, and I think that was the beginning. I think that that laid the foundation. So now our newsroom managers are going, oh, okay, so when we do this story, then maybe we should look at it this way. Or how about we call Al Edmondson or Stephanie Hightower or Carla Williams Scott and talk to them about why this is happening. Why don't we then bring more of these voices to the table? And that's where that change then starts to happen, when you listen, when you're willing to listen. Don't just pay lip service, but when you're willing to listen to all the different voices out there and then make sure that those voices are heard.
It's going to be uncomfortable sometimes,
Yeah.
but it's necessary. Yes, your question.
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Fox with Community Strategy Partners. My question has to do with the part of the media that we haven't really yet talked a lot about, that's not part of the FCC broadcast regulated media, that has an obligation for community service. So all that cable stuff and all that internet stuff out there, how do we begin to address the challenges there where there's not a requirement for truth or fairness or balance or any of those important things?
I'm going to let the young people answer this one, because
Well,
I try very hard not to do any of that stuff. It's frustrating.
I tell you what, if you look at any sort of platform and you look at what goes on in our media, you see some of the things that happen on the internet and even on Facebook and Twitter and these social media platforms, and the amount of hate that you see is despicable. And it wasn't until you started to have big companies and advertisers start saying, we're going to boycott advertising, then you started to see some changes in this. And so, one, you have to have those big corporations, money is power, right? And the more that they say that we're not advertising on your platform until you deal with this sort of hate, we have to start doing that, and instead just say, well, we're just kind of like, well, those are just fringe comments on the society, and that's just over there on the side. When these are pervasive narratives, and people are just saying things like they're truth, when in fact you've got propaganda machines, you've got all sorts of things that are spewing out this hate, and again, you have some leaders in power who are calling truth fake news. I mean, it is outrageous. We have normalized. Sometimes I wake up, I'm like, I cannot believe we are in the situation we're in. We have normalized this as okay, and somehow a conversation about masks is a takeover or something by the government. I mean, all these things that we see, we need advertisers, we need organizations to step up and speak more loudly than those loud voices on the fringe.
And most young people are getting their information from these other sources, and they're looking at that as news. They think that's news, and you can see the declining rate of folks who watch television, get their news from television, and the growing number of people who are like this. And that's what they think is real news. It's sad, it's tragic.
Got to work with trying to get those gatekeepers to pay attention here too, because you can boycott, you can do all these other things, but unless you get that change in the C-suite, unless you get that change where the people are making policy, making decisions, it's not going to go very far. Next question.
Bill Lafayette asks, could newsrooms make an effort to feature community leaders in the Near East Side and similar communities who are working to strengthen their neighborhoods? And Carla Williams-Scott asks a similar question. How can we get the media to report more positive things that are going on in the Black communities?
Well, and thank you to Carla Williams-Scott, who was one of the members of that little kitchen cabinet that I put together. And I think that, as I said, what we did by Zooming these community leaders, not the usual suspects, with some of our news managers, that was a good start. But there has to be somebody there who holds them accountable. There has to be somebody who says, well, you know what, once this all dies down, we can go back the way we used to do it. No, can't do it that way. You can't do it because then you're going to have that same problem raise up. So there has to be a real commitment on the part of the folks in that newsroom. That has to be part of the fabric. Part of their culture now is, oh, you know what? They've got this great book drive at Al Edmondson's barbershop. Let's go do that. This is a neighborhood trying to help neighborhood kids. Let's go cover that story. Instead of, oh, look, they're burning down Al Edmondson's barbershop. Let's go cover that story. So there has to be that commitment. And once those news managers are made aware, hey, we're watching you. We're making sure that this was not just a waste of Zoom, that y'all heard us. Once they're aware, then hopefully they're going to be more sensitized to the fact that all these stories need to be covered as well.
Sir, quickly, we're going to get your question.
Very quickly. On the subject of social media, there's pressure to regulate content. And I'm wondering if you envision a day when somebody does that with commercial media, specifically with respect to political advertising. A lot of that has racial overtones, and it's dog whistle, subliminal type messages. They're crafted, you know, by very intelligent people, and I'm just, there's very little truth in any of it. I'm just wondering if you envision that same thing happening in commercial media. Thank you.
That's going to be tough because just, you know, free speech regulations, political speech.
And dollars.
Yep, and just and dollars and where the dollars are coming from. So that's going to be tough. And so, you know, you're not necessarily going to see that in that same light. But that's why it's also important to support and uplift and provide the dollars and support for those who can speak truth to power in the midst of all this sorts of media. And I think, you know, and one last thing on the positive story front, we need to show those positive stories, but we also need to frame them in not ways like, you know, they beat the odds, and, you know, wow, congrats to them, and instead start to say, like, why were these systems like this in the first place? It's not because that individual has any sort of issue. It's because we have disinvested in education. We have disinvested in these neighborhoods. Those are policymakers who make those decisions, and whether you are in a suit or a hoodie, your Black life matters too. And we just need to make sure we're lifting those up as well.
One of my young friends, Kevin Tyler, started a campaign, a social media campaign called #StopKillingUs. And basically he just asked Black folks that he knows, just tell us about yourself as a person. Tell us about yourself. Show us a picture of yourself at your happiest. Tell what you like, what you don't like, because we want to be seen as people. We want to be seen as people. So just show a nice picture, put something happy. Yeah, I love all kinds of music. I hate polka music. I don't like cats. I like dogs. Whatever, to make you look like a person. And then #StopKillingUs, because we are all people.
Angela Pace and Kyle Strickland, thank you so much for joining us today.
I hope you found today's forum definitely informative. There's a lot of work to do. These are great voices that gave us direction. As an owner of a media company, I took a lot out of today. So we hope you'll tune in next Wednesday at noon online or in person here at the Boathouse as we continue the series, Racism, Where Do We Go From Here? Featuring 3 young Black women sharing their stories and perspectives of life in America for them. Thanks to our live stream partners, WOSU Public Media, PNC, the Dispatch Media Group, and WBNS, and to the Saunders Company for their support, and to our online virtual seat patrons. Thank you. Special thanks to our speakers, Kyle Strickland, Angela Pace, And of course, Jerry Revish. We hope to see you again soon. Until then, be safe.